Chapter 10. How King William Won the Whole Kingdom. 1. The Regency of Bishop Odo and Earl William. The rule of those whom King William left in England to govern in his name was not of a kind to win much love from the English people. William himself seems to have done all that he could to gain the goodwill of his new subjects, consistently with firmly establishing his own power. He could be harsh and even cruel when it served his purpose, but at no time does he seem to have been guilty of mere wanton oppression for oppression's sake. He was always strict in punishing open wrongdoers of any kind, of whatever nation. It was otherwise with his two lieutenants, Bishop Odo and Earl William Fitz-Osbern. If they did not actually take a pleasure in oppression, they at any rate allowed their followers to do whatever they chose, and whatever wrong an Englishman suffered, he could get no redress. Above all things, they everywhere built castles and allowed others to build them, and we have already seen with what horror our forefathers looked on the building of castles. It would almost seem as if oppression was worst immediately under the eyes of the two regents. At least it was in their own earldoms, in Odo's earldom of Kent and in William Fitz-Osbern's earldom of Hereford, that special outbreaks against the new king's authority now broke out. But the two movements were of a different kind. In Kent, which had fully submitted to William, the attempt was strictly a revolt against an established government. In Herefordshire, where the whole land had not submitted, men still tried, just as they might have done before the great battle, to keep the foreign invaders out of a district which they had not yet entered. 2. Edric in Herefordshire. The chief leader in resistance to the Normans on the Herefordshire border was Edric, a powerful man in those parts who had never submitted to the new king. He still kept part of the land quite free, holding out in the woods and other difficult places, whence the Normans called him the Wild or Savage. Earl William's men were always attacking him, but in vain. At last he made an alliance with the Welsh kings Bledin and Rhiwallon, those to whom the kingdom of Gruffydd had been given by Harold. With their help, he laid waste the land which had submitted to the Normans, and carried off great plunder. In fact, the Normans were never able to overcome Edric, and we shall hear of him again more than once. 3. Count Eustis at Dover. The Kentishmen, meanwhile, sought for help beyond the sea, as Edric had sought for help beyond the border. But it was a very strange helper that they chose. They sent to Count Eustis of Boulogne, the brother-in-law of King Edward, the same who had done so much harm at Dover in Edward's days, and who had been one of the four who mangled the dying Harold. They must indeed have been weary of Odo when they sent for Eustis to help him. Why Eustis listened to them is not very clear. William had given him lands in England. We do not hear of any quarrel between them, and Eustis could hardly have thought that he would be able to drive William out, and to make himself king instead. However this may be, he sailed across with some troops, and was joined by a large body of English, chiefly Kentishmen. Their first attempt was on the castle of Dover, but Eustis lost heart and gave way. The garrison sallied. His own force was routed, and he himself escaped to his own land. 4. William's return. Besides those who thus openly revolted against William or withstood his power, other Englishmen showed their discontent in various ways. Some left the country altogether, Others tried to get help in various parts, above all from King Sweyn in Denmark. Sweyn, it will be remembered, was nephew of Canute and cousin of Harold, and there had been talk of choosing him king 25 years before instead of Edward. If any foreign prince could really have delivered England, Sweyn was the man to do it. But he missed the right time, when so much of the land was still unsubdued. The worst was that Englishmen could not agree to act together. One district rose at one time and one at another. Some were for Sweyn, some for Edgar, some for the sons of Harold. Edwin and Morkere were for themselves. So there was no common action against William, and the land was lost bit by bit. In December, William came back. He held an assembly at Westminster, where much land was confiscated and granted out again. He also caused Count Eustis to be tried in his absence and outlawed. As Count of Boulogne, Eustis owed William no allegiance, but as his man holding lands in England, he could be thus tried and outlawed. In after times, Eustis gained the king's favor again, and got back his lands. William also sent embassies to various foreign princes to hinder anything from being done against him in their lands. Especially, he sent the English abbot Athelcige as ambassador to King Sweyn, and he made 2 appointments which are worth noticing. The bishopric of Dorchester was vacant, so he gave it to a Norman monk, Remigius, of Fécamp. This was the beginning of a system which he carried on through his whole reign, that of giving bishoprics, as they became vacant, to Normans and other foreigners. Also, the earldom of Northumberland was vacant by the death of Oswulf. William had not the least authority in Northumberland, yet he made a show of again granting, or rather in truth of selling, the earldom of Gospatric, a man of the kin of the old earls. But Gospatric was as yet no more able to take possession than Copsige had been. 5. The Siege of Exeter. In the spring of 1068, William began seriously to undertake the conquest of that part of England where his kingship was still a mere name. All western, central, and northern England, all Northumberland in the old sense, the greater part of Mercia, and a large part of Wessex, was still unsubdued. At this moment, the state of things in the west was specially threatening. Exeter, above all, the greatest city of the west, was the center of all resistance. Githa, the widow of Godwine and mother of Harold, was there, most likely with her grandsons, Godwine, Edmund, and Magnus. The citizens of Exeter made leagues with the other towns of the west. Men joined them from other parts of England. If the other unconquered districts had risen at the same time, and if they could all have agreed on some one course, it may be that even now William could have been driven out. But while the west was in arms, the north stayed quiet, and even in Exeter itself men were not fully of one mind. Before William went forth to war, he sent a message to the men of Exeter, demanding that they should swear oaths to him and receive him into the city. They sent word that they would pay him the tribute which they had been used to pay to the old kings, but that they would swear no oaths to him, nor receive him within their walls. That is, they would be a separate commonwealth, paying him tribute, but they would not have him as their immediate king. William was not likely to allow this kind of half-submission, so he began his march against Exeter, taking care to call on the force of the shires, which were already conquered, to come with him. To strike fear into his chief enemy, he took and harried the towns of Dorset on his way. The great men of the city were frightened, and sent to William, making submission and giving hostages. But the commons disowned the submission. So William laid siege to the city, after he had put out the eyes of one of the hostages. Exeter held out bravely for 18 days, and was then taken by undermining one of the towers. William then entered the city, and granted his pardon to the citizens. Githa and her companions meanwhile escaped by the river. The king then caused a castle, called Rogemont, or the Red Hill, to be built to keep the city in his power, and he greatly raised the amount of its tribute. But he seems to have done no further harm. 6. The Conquest of the West. The taking of Exeter was followed, at once or before long, by the conquest of all western England. Dorset, Devonshire, Somerset, Cornwall, and most likely Gloucestershire and Worcestershire were now added to William's dominions. But Edric still held out in his corner of Herefordshire. William was now master of all Wessex and East Anglia, and of part of Mercia. His conquest of the western lands was clearly followed by many confiscations and grants of land. Above all, the king's brother, Count Robert, got nearly all Cornwall, and large estates in other shires. Among these, he got the hill in Somerset, where the Holy Cross of Waltham had been found, and which the Normans called Montacute, or the Peaked Hill. William now thought that things were quiet enough for him to bring his wife to England. So at Pentecost 1068, the Lady Matilda was hallowed to Queen at Westminster by Archbishop Edric. 7. The First Conquest of the North. Meanwhile, just after the West was subdued, the North was in arms. Though Edwin, Morkere, and Gospatric were nominally William's earls in northern England, yet their earldoms had never submitted, and the earls themselves seemed to have lived chiefly at William's court. But now, all northern England made ready to resist, York being naturally the center of the movement, as Exeter had been in the west. They got the Welsh to help them, and sent messages to Scotland and Denmark. The whole land was in arms, and now Earl Gospatric went out and joined his own people, and so did Edgar the Atheling, and seemingly the Earls Edwin and Morkere also. So there was no lack of leaders. King William marched to meet them as far as Warwick, seemingly his first conquest in this campaign. Near that town the English army met him, but the hearts of Edwin and Morkere failed them. They submitted, and were restored to their earldoms and to William's seeming favor. One of the king's daughters was even promised in marriage to Edwin. The army now dispersed. Only a party of the bolder men marched northwards and held Durham. Gospatric, with Edgar and his mother and sisters, found shelter with King Malcolm in Scotland. William had now nothing to do but to march northward, taking one town after another. Some, it would seem, were taken by force, while others submitted peaceably. In all cases, he built a castle to keep the town in order. But there was a great difference in his treatment of one town and shire and another. In some parts, many more Englishmen kept their lands and offices than in others. These were doubtless those which submitted most quietly. In this way, he occupied most likely Leicester and certainly Nottingham, and so went on to York. The city submitted quietly, but a castle was built. Having thus gained the capital of the north and the main center of resistance, William did not this time go any further, but marched back another way, occupying Lincoln, Stamford, Cambridge, and Huntingdon. These two campaigns of the year 1068 gave William a greater part of England than he had won in 1066. Northumberland, in the narrower sense, with Durham, and northwestern Mercia, with Chester as the chief city, were all that now remained unsubdued. But William's hold on some of the lands which had submitted was still very insecure. 8. The Sons of Harold. The same year, 1068, the three sons of Harold, Godwine, Edmund, and Magnus, who had escaped with their grandmother Githa, came back by sea with a force from Ireland, doubtless chiefly Irish Danes. But they did nothing except plunder. They were driven off from Bristol, and then fought a battle with the men of Somerset, who were led by Ednoth, a man who had been their father's staller, or master of the horse, but who was now in the service of William. Ednoth was killed, and Harold's son sailed away, having only made matters worse. Sometime in the same year, William had a son born to him in England, namely, his youngest son Henry. He was the only one of his sons who was born after his father was crowned, so he alone, according to English notions, was a real atheling. Moreover, he was brought up as an Englishman. He was afterwards King Henry I. 9. The First Revolt of York. Neither the North nor the West long remained quiet. The year 1069 was still fuller of fighting than the year 1068. But this was the year in which England was really conquered. At the Christmas feast of 1068, William again made a grant of the earldom of Northumberland, in the narrower sense. That land was still quite unsubdued, but now that he had York, it would be easier to attack Durham and the parts beyond. So the king granted the earldom to one Robert of Comines, who set out with a Norman army to take possession. But he fared no better than Copsiege had done. The men of the land determined to withstand him. But through the help of Bishop Athelwine, he entered Durham peaceably. But he let his men plunder, so the men of the city and neighborhood rose and slew him and all his followers. This success encouraged the men of Yorkshire and their leaders who had fled to Scotland. Gospatrick and Edgar came back. They were welcomed at York and laid siege to the castle. But King William at once marched north, drove them away, built a second castle, and left his friend Earl William of Hereford in command. He then sent a force against Durham, but it got no further than Northallerton. No sooner was the king gone than the English again attacked the castles at York, but they were defeated by Earl William. And a little later, in June, Harold's sons came again and plundered in Devonshire, but were driven away. So the land was harried alike, by friends and by foes. 10. The Coming of the Danes. All this shows how all efforts were in vain, simply for want of a real leader, a king of men, like Harold or Edmund Ironside. Englishmen could fight, but their fighting was of no use when there was no steadiness in the chief men, no concert between one part of the land and another. In fact, they seem to have fought best when they had no earls or other great men at their head, when each district fought for itself. In the autumn of this year 1069, there was the best chance of deliverance of all. A large part of England was in arms at once. The West rose. The men of Somerset and Dorset besieged the new castle of Montacute. The men of Devonshire and Cornwall besieged the new castle of Exeter. On the Welsh border, Edric, with a host of Welsh and English, attacked Shrewsbury. Staffordshire, too, which most likely had not yet submitted, was in arms. But all these movements were put down, one by one, save that Staffordshire was left alone for a while. Meanwhile, yet greater things were doing in the north. King Sweyn of Denmark at last sent a great fleet to the help of the English, under his brother Osbjorn and his sons Harold and Canute. After some vain attempts on Dover, Sandwich, Ipswich, and Norwich, the Danes entered the Humber, and the English came joyfully to meet them. All the chief men of the north joined them. Edgar and Gospatrick came back from Scotland, and this time Earl Waltheof joined them. William's commanders at York, William Mallet, he who had first buried Harold's body, and Gilbert of Ghent, sent word to the king that they could hold out for a whole year. But it was not so. The host, Danish and English, began to march on York, and Archbishop Eldred, worn out with troubles, died as they were coming. The Norman commanders now set fire to the houses near the castles, and a great part of the city was burned. The Danes and English soon reached York. The Normans sallied, and were some cut to pieces, some made prisoners, the two leaders being among the prisoners. In this fight, Earl Waltheof slew many of the enemy, and won himself great fame. The castles were broken down, and York was now quite free from the Normans. But instead of holding the city, the English dispersed, and the Danes went back to their ships. 11. The final conquest of the North. When King William heard of the fall of York, he at once marched northwards. But when he found that his enemies were all scattered, he left his brother, Robert, in Lindsey, to act against the Danes, while he himself went and subdued Staffordshire, seemingly by hard fighting. He then marched to York and recovered the city. And now he did one of the most frightful deeds of his life. He caused all northern England, beginning with Yorkshire, to be utterly laid waste, that its people might not be able to fight against him any more. The havoc was fearful. Men were starved or sold themselves as slaves, and the land did not recover for many years. Then King William wore his crown and kept his Christmas feast at York. In January 1070, he set out to conquer the extreme north, which was still unsubdued. The Earls Waltheof and Gospatrick now craved his pardon. They were restored to their earldoms, and Waltheof received the king's niece Judith in marriage. William then went on to Durham, where the bishop and nearly everybody had fled from the city, and ravaged the whole land as he had ravaged Yorkshire. He then went back to York by a very hard winter's march, and settled the affairs of his new conquests. He was now at last master of all Northumberland, Dara and Bernicia alike. 12. End of the conquest. Still, William had not yet possession of all England. Not only did Edric still hold out on his border, and it may be that the Isle of Eli had never fully submitted, but one whole corner of England and one of the chief cities still held out. This was Chester. Now then, in February 1070, William made another hard winter march from York to Chester. The sufferings of the army were frightful, and many of the mercenaries mutinied. But William went on and received the submission of the last free English city, whether peaceably or by fighting, we know not. He built castles at Chester and Stafford. He then marched to Salisbury, where he reviewed and dismissed his army, as having now won the whole land. And so, in truth, he had. If a few points were still unsubdued, no whole shire or great town held out against him. At last, more than 3 years after his coronation, he was really king of the whole land, in fact as well as in name. From henceforth, such opposition to him as we still hear of was no longer resistance to an invader, but rather revolt against an established, though foreign, government. 13. The new archbishops. William had now time to turn his mind to the affairs of the church. Things had naturally got into confusion during the time of warfare, and besides this, William had made up his mind to subdue the Church of England as well as the state, or rather, to make the church a means whereby to hold the kingdom more firmly. As he gradually transferred the greatest estates and highest temporal offices from Englishmen to strangers, so it was part of his policy to do the same with the chief offices of the church. His rule was that as the bishops died, Normans or other strangers should be put in their places, and that those of the English bishops against whom any kind of charge could be brought should be deprived without waiting for their deaths. With the abbots, the rule was less strict. Their temporal position was not so important as that of the bishops. So, though several English abbots were deposed and many foreign abbots were appointed, still many more Englishmen kept their places than among the bishops, and some Englishmen even received abbeys from William himself. In doing all this, he had the help of Pope Alexander and of those who advised him, for it was part of William's policy to strengthen the connection of England with Rome, though he firmly refused to give up a whit of his own royal power. At the Easter feast of 1070, 2 papal legates came, and when the king wore his crown, it was they who put it on his head. A council was then held, in which Archbishop Stigand was deposed, as his right to the archbishopric had all along been thought doubtful. His successor was one of the most famous scholars in Europe. This was Lanfranc of Pavia, in Lombardy, who had settled in Normandy and become a monk, and was now abbot of the monastery of St. Stephen at Caen, which William himself had founded. Lanfranc became archbishop in August, and was William's right-hand man for the rest of his reign. The other archbishopric also was vacant by the death of Edric of York. At Pentecost, this was given to a Norman, Thomas, a canon of Bayeux, also a great scholar and a careful bishop. For many of William's appointments were very good in themselves, if only the men chosen had not been strangers. These 2 new archbishops went the next year to Rome to receive from the Pope the pallium, or badge of metropolitan dignity. So England had 2 foreign primates. Stigand's other bishopric of Winchester was also given to another Norman, Walchelin. And so the work went on through the whole of William's reign, till at the end St. Wulfstan of Worcester was the only Englishman who was a bishop in England. 14. The Danes at Eli. Before the 2 foreign archbishops were consecrated, there was again fighting in England. The Danish fleet, which after all had done so little for England, stayed in the Humber while William was subduing Northumberland. William then gave bribes to the Danish commander Osbjorn, and it was agreed that the Danes should sail back when the winter was over, and that meanwhile they might plunder in England. Thus again was the land harried by friends and foes alike. At last, in May 1070, the Danes sailed to the Fenland and showed themselves at Eli. The people welcomed them, believing that they would win the land. Most likely they were ready to have Sweyn for king. Thus the revolts began almost at the moment when the conquest was finished. We now hear, for the first time, of the famous name of Hereward. All manner of strange and impossible tales are told of him, but very little is known for certain about him, though what we do know is quite enough to set him before us as a stout champion of England. He had held lands in Lincolnshire, and he had fled away from England, but when or why is not known. He would seem to have come back about the time when the Danes came to Eli, and he joined himself with them and with the men of the land who helped them. The Abbey of Peterborough was now vacant by the death of its abbot Brand, and William had given it to a Norman named Turld. He was a very stern man, and came with a body of Norman soldiers to take possession of the abbey. But Hereward was before him. Lest the wealth of the abbey should be turned to help the enemy, he came, June 1st, 1070, with the Danes and the men of the land, and plundered the monastery. The Danes now went away, taking with them much of the spoil of Peterborough. But when they got home, King Swegan banished his brother, Earl Osbjorn, for having taken bribes from William, and having done so little for England. 15. The Defense of Eli. About this time, Edric the Wild submitted to the king, which marks that all resistance was over on his side of England. But the revolt went on in the Fenland. The monastery of Eli was the center of resistance, as it stood in a land which then was really an island, and which was very easy to defend. The abbot Thurston, who had been appointed by King Harold, and his monks, were at first zealous for the patriots. Men flocked to the isle from all parts, and they held out all the winter of 1070, and through the greater part of the next year. In the spring of 1071, the two earls, Edwin and Morkere, at last left William's court, being, it is said, afraid lest the king should put them in bonds. Edwin tried to get to Scotland, but he was killed on the way, either by his own men or by Normans to whom he was betrayed. But Morkere made his way to Eli, and helped in the defense of the isle. Other chief men came also, but it is clear that the soul of the enterprise was Hereward. There are many tales told of his exploits, but this at least is certain. William came and attacked the isle from all points, and there was much fighting for many months, in which William Mallet, whom the Danes had released, was killed. At last, in October 1071, the isle surrendered. Some say that the monks of Eli, when the king seized their lands outside the isle, turned traitors. Others, that Morkere and the other chiefs grew faint-hearted. Anyhow, the war was at an end. The king took possession of the isle. He built a castle at Eli, and laid a fine on the abbey, while Morkere and others were kept in prison. Hereward alone did not submit, but sailed out into the sea unconquered. There are several stories of his end. It seems most likely that he was at last received into William's favor, and even served under him in his wars on the mainland. But some say that he was killed by a party of Normans who set upon him without any orders from the king, and that he died fighting bravely, one man against many. 16. Summary. Thus we have seen that after 5 years from William's first landing, he was in full possession of the kingdom, and had put down all opposition everywhere. The great battle had given him real possession of southeastern England only, but it had given him the great advantage of being crowned king before the end of the year. During the year 1067, William made no further conquests. All western and northern England remained unsubdued, but except in Kent and Herefordshire, there was no fighting in any part of the land which had really submitted. The next 2 years were the time in which all England was really conquered. The former part of 1068 gave William the West. The latter part of that year gave him central and northern England as far as Yorkshire, the extreme north and northwest being still unsubdued. The attempt to win Durham in the beginning of 1069 led to 2 revolts at York. Later in the year, all the north and west was again in arms, and a Danish fleet came. But the revolts were put down one by one, and the great winter campaign of 1069 to 1070 conquered the still unsubdued parts, ending with the taking of Chester. Early in 1070, the whole land was for the first time in William's possession. There was no more fighting, and he was able to give his mind to the more peaceful part of his schemes, what we may call the conquest of the native church by the appointment of foreign bishops. But in the summer of 1070 began the revolt of the Fenland and the Defense of Eli, which lasted till the autumn of 1071. After that, William was full king everywhere, without dispute. There was no more national resistance. There was no revolt of any large part of the country. There were still wars within the Isle of Britain, but they were wars in which William could give out that he was, as King of the English, fighting for England. And there was one considerable revolt within the Kingdom of England, but it was not a revolt of the people. The conquest of the land, as far as fighting goes, was now finished. We have now to see how the land fared under a king who claimed to be king by law, but who had to win his crown by fighting at the head of an invading army. His rule, as we shall see, was neither that of a king who had really succeeded according to law, nor yet that of a mere invader, who did not even make any pretense to a legal right.